Achille Mbembe needs no introduction for us in South Africa and for many across the globe. But it's a tradition that before a keynote speaker delivers a talk, it has to be preceded by some kind of honoring of the speaker by telling you who he is, although you already know who he is. He was born in Cameroon, and we are proud to say he's now a South African. He obtained his PhD in history at the Sorbonne in Paris in 1989, and other degrees in political science at the Institute. I had a friend help me practice this, at the Institut d'études politiques in Paris. So I had my dear friend Jennifer, that's why we delayed. I was practicing this, but I realized I can't pretend. I just have to speak the truth about it. Achille was assistant professor of history at Columbia University in New York from 1988 to 1991, a senior research fellow at the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C., from 1991 to 1992, associate professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania from 92 to 96, executive director of the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, otherwise known as CODESTRIA, in Dakar, Senegal, for 4 years, from 96 to 2000. He has been visiting professor at various institutions over the years, including Yale University, California, University of California in Berkeley. Achille is very well known for his writings on several topics related to African history, politics, post-colonialism, now more recently decolonization. One of his most famous books, many of you will recognize the book on the post-colony, was first published in French in Paris in 2000, and the English translation published by the University of California Press in 2001. In 2015, he won awards for some of his books. He's written about 7 books since 1985, which are widely published across languages. One of his most famous books for us, and I'm very proud to say I was privileged to launch the book with him as in conversation with him at the book lounge last year. His book that was first published in French, but now in English, A Critique of Black Reason, a book that has won awards and a book that many of us refer to from various disciplines. Achille has won several honors and awards, one of which is the Gerda Henkel Prize about 2 years ago. So ladies and gentlemen, without much further ado, I give you the much awaited, as we say in these regions, Achille, our national treasure. Over to you.
I thought after all that she had gone through, she wouldn't be in the state you have seen. So I'm happy to see that Pumla is well and she's still running. Many must have told you how grateful we all are for the dedication and the generosity and the intelligence you have put into this conference. I would like to add my voice to the chorus. I would also like to thank you for your intellectual leadership here in South Africa and in the continent. We have benefited a lot from it. So the title of my intervention is The Trauma of the World and the World as Trauma. This is what I would like to do. I would like to use the three categories of debt, of restitution, and of reparation. I would like to use these three categories in order to revisit what we have come to know as, quote unquote, historical trauma. And I would like to do this dwelling on the African and Diasporic Archive, if such a term has any meaning at all. Indeed, of modern African and diasporic thought, two things can be said. Of course, lots of things can be said, but I'm particularly interested in two. First of all, it can be said that modern African and diasporic thought has been, for the most part, a long meditation on the reality of trauma. The trauma of the world and the world as trauma. It has been a long meditation on what it is to live with trauma and on how to return to life after trauma. You can look into this archive, whether in terms of writings, in terms of music, in terms of artistic creativity. This is a theme that is saturating this archive. Second, it can also be said that in modern African and diasporic thought, trauma has been the lens through which struggles for universal justice have been given a very specific meaning. These struggles have been political, but they have also been psychic and even ontological. The talk will consist of 4 clusters of observations and comments. First of all, I will look into 2, let's just call them traumatogenic institutions, institutions that produce trauma, capitalism on the one hand, and liberal democracy on the other. 2 traumatogenic institutions that are dealt with ad nauseam in the archive I am looking into. After that, I will examine a dilemma this archive has been dealing with, the dilemma of violence and something we should call political interiority. I will then move on to dwell on current debates concerning what is known as social death, especially in the Afro-pessimist tradition or versions of it, social death, and questions of care and repair. I will end with brief considerations on what it might be to write trauma and healing, as all of this emerges precisely in these archives. Now, questions of historical trauma in modernity have been, for the most part, examined from the point of view of the human body, the human psyche, the inner self, human interiority, and so forth and so on. In most instances, the category of the human itself and what constitutes it, this has often been taken for granted or for the most part left uninterrogated. And yet, there are genealogies of trauma and of the human in modernity which suggest that such an anthropocentric perspective is limited. It is limited partly because the human in question, at least in the tradition I'm dealing with, has always been a bit less than the human. Such has been particularly the case since the encounter between capitalism and racial slavery. We therefore have to revisit political histories of trauma from the perspective of that human, quote unquote, who was institutionally and juridically turned into an object under the regime of racial capitalism. What I mean by that is that political histories of trauma are not simply about the human. They are also about objects, insofar as certain figures of the human have been juridically and institutionally turned into objects, things, or if you want, commodities. And since I mentioned capitalism, I owe you not a lengthy explanation, but at least two observations. Capitalism, the kind of capitalism that is spoken about in the African and Afro-diasporic archive, this kind of capitalism exhibits two attributes I would like to point out. It is, of course, an economic system, an apparatus of capture and extraction, capture of bodies, and extraction of labor. But the kind of capitalism that is spoken about in the African and Afro-diasporic archive must also be understood as a certain mode of production of things and redistribution of objects, the compulsion to put things in order as a precondition for extracting their inner value. It is the compulsion to categorize, to separate, to measure, to name, to classify, and to establish equivalences between things in themselves and between things and persons, persons and animals, animals and the so-called natural, mineral, organic, and even the atmospheric world. It goes without saying that whenever an order is manufactured and value is extracted, whether one likes it or not, that which is deemed valueless is made redundant. So, in that sense, capitalism has to do with the making redundant of classes of people who are, by that very fact, destituted, if you want, from the overall category of the human and assigned other positions in the overall order of things. So if you want, it's about separating what is useful from waste. In its genealogy of trauma in modernity, Afro-diasporic thought takes as its point of departure this originary fact. It takes seriously capitalism's impulse to abolish limits, to abolish, in fact, some of the key dualisms without which the very idea of society would have been unimaginable. One such taboo capitalism does fundamentally disregard is the notion that a human being is not a thing. So if you want, in this archive I'm talking about, that is the originary trauma. Just as others talk about the originary sin, the originary trauma here is the historical process by which certain classes of people are turned into things. And that is what this tradition is dealing with. How is it that we survive in the aftermath of our having been turned into things, into commodities, into objects? Now, of course, humanhood is the antithesis of thinghood or objecthood. And as we know, this idea that humanhood is the antithesis of thinghood, this idea is pretty central to the modern project of emancipation. It is central to our understanding of what alienation is all about. But it is also central to notions of justice and restitution, of reparation, or even notions of therapy as such. So in this archive, therapy is understood from that vantage point. So in that sense, capitalism is fundamentally a traumatogenic institution. So that's the first set of comments on the first traumatogenic institution, capitalism. Now, I would like to make another set of comments on the other institution, liberal democracy, and one of its core foundations, which is racial pessimism. Now, in fact, historically, what is known as liberal democracy is built intrinsically on something I call racial pessimism, and I'll tell you why in a second. I don't know how many of you have read Tocqueville's Democracy in America, Volume 2, especially the last chapter. In that last chapter of Volume 2, Tocqueville examines, I quote him, race relations, end of quote, in the context of American democracy. He agrees that from the beginning to the end, the history of race relations in America has been a traumatic history, and the term is his. He concludes that, in fact, there is no future for an American democracy that would truly accommodate, quote-unquote, non-whites, in particular, blacks, and, I quote him again, the other so-called races. He then goes on to provide a set of justifications for this impossibility and basically argues for one form or another of, I quote him again, repatriation of the Negroes to Africa. You will have noticed that repatriation is not exactly the same thing as reparation. Deportation and repatriation if you want, are always animated by, let's just call it as it is, a genocidal unconscious. You want to get rid of people you do not want to live with. There are many different ways of getting rid of them. One is to wipe them out of the surface of the earth. The other is to evict them, get them to flee, so that you do not see them, you don't owe anything to them, and you are not forced to live with them. You send them somewhere else. That's repatriation or deportation. There are many forms of repatriation. In the case of blacks in America, there was the movement of self-repatriation that led, for instance, to the establishment of the colony of Liberia, Sierra Leone, that was fueled by Garveyism, so forth and so on. That's self-repatriation. But there is also a second form of repatriation that has to do with deportation. What Tocqueville has in mind is the second form of repatriation. So, he's not thinking about a democracy of connections between different parts, different segments or fractions of the population. His concept of democracy is about how to extricate, how to disentangle different segments of the population from each other. It is underpinned, his concept of democracy, by a line of separation, which is at the same time a line of purity, which almost inevitably will morph into a line of death and a line of pure destruction. This does not only confirm what we already knew, which is that, in fact, liberal democracy and racism are compatible, but also that, historically, liberal democracy has always needed for its own self-legitimation a constitutive other who is and is not at the same time part of the polis. This inner bifurcation, which I call racial pessimism, is at the very heart of the liberal democratic order. And therefore, when in this archive I'm dealing with, trauma is evoked, it is very often in relation to the damage wrought by racism. Racism has embedded in the very order of what is presumed to be freedom. But even more so, we recognize pessimism or racial pessimism wherever the language of impossibility or insurmountability, which is, you find it, I have counted, but I can't remember how many times Tocqueville uses the term insurmountable. So when the language of impossibility and insurmountability saturates speech or becomes the final word in any utterance, with Tocqueville, pessimism is also articulated in the language of indivisibility and the impossibility of sharing. And this business of the inability to share is a major trope in African Afro-diasporic vocabularies of trauma. For him, Tocqueville, I promise I'll speak about him for one more minute and then we'll move on. For him, and I quote him again, the white race is both absolute and indivisible. It cannot be shared. The freedom of the white race is indivisible. It can't be shared with any non-white entity. It is the deep belief and conviction of white America, he suggests, that the freedom of whites, of the white race, is not simply indivisible. It can only prosper at the expense of the life of non-whites, even if this prospect might ultimately lead to its disappearance in a catastrophe. So, racial pessimism stems from the belief that for white America to exist, it must produce quote-unquote Negroes. Negroes being what? Negroes being, in fact, a complex of bodies in chain. That's what Negro, the term Negro, means within this configuration. It doesn't refer to any individual human being with a face, with a name, with a body on the move. It refers to a mass of bodies in chain, which has been, of course, a feature, historical feature, from the moment of the institution of the plantation to the cultural landscapes of America today, where you move from slavery to prison. So I could go on and on this, but the words I have used and the references I have shared with you already signal that we are at the heart of a trauma that is not only historical, but a trauma we're still living with as we speak. And therefore, it has been a major object of inquiry, of meditation in African and diasporic thought. Now let me move on and signal that the kind of politics that stems from this kind of absolutely racially circumscribed commons, it is one that disavows passages and bridges. And that's why it's somewhat interesting to contrast the racial pessimism of Achille de Tocqueville and certain strands of Afro-pessimism. And I'll move on now to mention some of these strands, knowing very well that I'm moving into a very controversial terrain. It seems to me that certain versions of Afro-pessimism are also premised on the idea of a categorical antagonism that cannot be transcended. What I'm trying to do now is, how is it that one responds to the kind of originary trauma Tocqueville has made explicit? Of course, there are many different ways of responding to it. Afro-pessimism is one attempt at overcoming that trauma. And what I'm suggesting is that it does it in ways that are not entirely dissimilar to the main argument Tocqueville is putting forward. So Afro-pessimism believes that this categorical antagonism called race or racism cannot be transcended, especially when it is tethered to the hydraulic power of liberal democracy in America. Or that it can only be transcended through a war that is and is not a mere civil war, a war that would be waged against the very concept of humanity, as Frank Wilderson puts it, that in order to break the Gordian knot, we have to go to war. It will, and it will not be a civil war. Even more importantly, is a war that has to be waged against the very notion of humanity. Since, at least so the story goes, this concept is indeed the Trojan horse which trapped us in a permanent state of death, or in a permanent state of social death. The concept of social death being borrowed from Homey's colleague at Harvard, the Jamaican-born Orlando Patterson. So as a matter of fact, at work here is a kind of mimetic relationship between two forms of asymmetrical racisms, a hegemonic racism and a subaltern racism, both of which speak the same language, but with different accents. True, they do not operate on the same plane, but they do share the same fantasy of a freedom that is only freedom for oneself, indivisible and absolute in the face of an absolute outside. So that's one way in which, in the Afro-African diasporic tradition, archive, the question of how to emerge out of trauma is dealt with. But that's not the only one. And I would now like to, let's say, gesture towards another proposition that is ridden, I would say, with a tension between violence and what I call political interiority. So indeed, the idea that historical trauma can only be surmounted through a destructive and yet liberating kind of violence is something that is still with us. It's there in the archive. The later liberating kind of violence is supposed to fulfill a double function. It is a violence that, on the one hand, must be signal, in any case, a break with the past. On the other hand, it is a violence that supposedly opens up the possibility of another way of seeing, another way of being in the world, a violence that in that opening may be even constructive rather than simply destructive, a violence that supposedly clears a space for the production of another way of being. That in order to institute a rupture with this terrible history, violence is absolutely necessary. The main interlocutor, obviously, here is Fanon. Now, the thing is this. I know that, Afro-pessimism is making big inroads here in South Africa too. And a lot of our young people are invoking Fanon. I don't know whether they are reading him. In any case, they are invoking him. Now, the fact is this. As far as the violence of the subaltern is concerned, Fanon is more circumspect than we have been led to believe. And this we know now that most of his writings are at hand, including his psychiatric writings. Early on, we could pretend that we didn't know about his psychiatric writings. We only dealt with his political writings, which itself presupposed that there is a distinction between the two. But now we don't have that excuse any longer. So this is what Fanon says. Now I'm speaking like Lewis Gordon, who just wrote a book called What Fanon Said. So let me correct myself immediately. Not all forms of violence embraced by the subaltern are therapeutic. That's one of the major lessons we learn from Fanon's considerations on violence. Not all of them are therapeutic. In fact, he distinguishes between many different kinds of violence. First, he talks about a kind of violence that precedes the awakening of the subaltern to self-consciousness. Such violence, he argues, is mostly self-inflicted. That we may have been traumatized, and in fact, we keep traumatizing ourselves through a set of mechanisms, one of which is, in this case, certain forms of violence. Such violence is mostly self-inflicted, or when it is not inflicted upon oneself, it is of a fratricidal nature. It's violence against the fellow subaltern. This kind of violence, Fanon argues, has no liberatory potential, and he has extraordinary ways of describing it, the way it finds expression in the life of the muscles, in bodily contortions, the way in which it is almost reptilian. It expresses itself, he says, in pantomime and all kinds of rituals of possession, during which healing is experienced as a phantasmatic event. So this is one form among many of the violence of the subaltern. Then you have a second form of violence, potentially liberatory, the aim of which is, first of all, to disrupt and eventually to interrupt the colonial order of things. Interruption and disruption with the goal of opening up an entirely new possibility of being together, of being in common. It's not simply of me being. It is of being with others, being together, and being in common, the possibility of what he calls companionship, the possibility of inhabiting a different body, the body of a different being. So it's a future-oriented violence, the function of which is to make it possible to reinvent the human, to lead to, I quote him, the emergence of a new species of man. So it seems to me that we have to read his critique of violence in relation to his practice of caring and healing both the tortured and the torturer, his practice of consoling, of attending to the diseased mind, the distraught body of everybody, which he does now that we can read his medical text. This is what he is busy doing. So, the paradoxical nature of Fanonian violence is something I think we should hold on to. Fanon is aware of the fact that it is in the nature of violence to open up to that which we cannot entirely control, even when our intentions are morally just. The actual unfolding of violent processes is something very difficult to predict, let alone to control. Now, let me contrast this with the other kind of violence, which implies a tremendous amount of work on the self. It has nothing to do with self-destruction or inflicting damage to oneself or to the other who looks like me. It's a deep, serious work on the self. Take, for instance, Nelson Mandela. And what happens when he finds himself in a cell, that kind of tiny, empty space where political prisoners were reduced to the bare minimum, to literally nakedness. Under conditions of captivity, they hardly belonged to themselves. They belonged to their captors, which in Mandela's case was the racist state. And yet, in the midst of all of this, Mandela was able to redesign the landscapes of his inner self, of which he talks about in his book, Conversations with Myself, a book that has not been the object of serious scrutiny since it was published. In that, what is the story of that book, or the fragments of stories in that book? They mostly have to do with the ways in which he slowly shed parts of his old self. He tried to recover traces of his past, to refigure them, how he underwent a profound metamorphosis, even a transfiguration. And that's the beauty of the South African tradition of political struggle, which you find in Mandela, but also in the likes of Walter Sisulu, the biography, the big biography that was dedicated to him. It's all about transfiguration as the building of an inner potential, inner capacity, in order to keep being one's own master in the face of tremendous adversity. And in order to never fall into resentment, in order to achieve a certain state of felicity that is produced by the struggle and the disposition one is in to give it all. This has nothing to do with the kind of primary violence Fanon was indeed rightfully critiquing. So what we have to deal with here is an interiority that is not reducible to anything made by others or imposed on us by others. It is an interiority that is self-directed, self-produced, at least to a degree, but always in interaction and conversation with a sort of outside. And it's not something that is an empty cipher formed by that outside. And is much more complicated than, let's say, picking up a gun and shooting at the first you see. So here, that's what political interiority stands for, a kind of method, a kind of discipline, pedagogy, all of that together, and all of that involving serious, demanding work on oneself not only as a political subject, but also oneself as a beautiful human being. I could go on and on this. I won't, because my timekeeper is telling me that it's time to stop. But I will just ask for a little bit of indulgence and try to wrap it up, let's say, in a way that is satisfactory for all of us. And I can't wrap it up without saying one or two things about this question of care and repair. You see, the question of caring and repairing saturates the African Afro-diasporic archive. It's all about that. It's all about trauma. It's all about how is it that you fix that which has been broken. It's all over the literature. It's all over the novel, the poetry, theology, music, expressive arts in general. So it's important that we give a few minutes to this question of care and repair. You see, throughout the slaves' captivity in the Americas, since we started with Black America, it was not simply a matter of social death. The work of producing symbols, producing rituals, language, memory, meaning, and therefore the substance necessary to sustain life, that work never stopped. Nor did the interminable labor of caring and repairing that which had been broken, including the infrastructures of survival. The much used concept of fugitivity, which a number of young African Americans are using today, hardly exhausts the repertoire of practices of survival, actually required. For once, to get out of the hole and to break through the wall, the captured subject must actively engage in a relation of multiple doubles and multiple selves. He or she must develop an extraordinary capacity to become imperceptible, to continually shift from one self to its alternate, to inhabit the tiniest of cracks and fissures. He or she must know how and when to become like everybody else, how and when to be nobody, when to be alone, when to hide, when to no longer have anything to hide, when to become unfindable, and when to rush to the other side in order to meet one's double. And these micro movements, micro postures, were essential because survival depended on being able to inhabit multiple selves, often at the same time. And this tradition of dispersing oneself, knowing when to retreat, knowing when to come out, when to shut up, when to speak. You see it, just read Amos Tutuola. You will find it all there. The same thing with reparation. You see, I'm moving towards the end. What strikes me when traveling in the continent, which I do quite a lot, is that in every single major urban center in the continent, when you land, the most striking thing is the number of people busy repairing something. Whether a car, because our cars, they collapse very easily. The roads are terrible. First of all, they already come almost dismembered. We remember them. Just go to any garage, in Abidjan, Lagos. Sorry? And the business of putting together back a car. And we have all kinds of cars with prosthesis. So a car, what else? A shoe, a tire, a house, a piece of dress, every single little thing. Or people start building a house, run out of money, then live for years in an unfinished structure, take a long time to save again, and then they pick it up where they left off, and gradually it becomes something else. This becoming something else. This becoming somebody else. That is how we heal trauma. In nurturing the capacity to become somebody else. To move towards meeting the unknown. The encounter with the unknown, the encounter with that which is not expected. It seems to me that we have to take this seriously if we are to reanimate studies of trauma and studies of healing. And in that sense, to repair is to be alive and to take care of something that matters, because that thing is a very condition of my survival with others, my being with others, my moving on with others, my leaving something behind for others, something through which they might remember me, and something through which I become an ancestor. This question of political ancestry, of which Pumla has told us so much about. So reparation is the opposite of destruction. It's about building a liberating memory. It's also about self-address. It's a self-address, however, made possible only through its relation to others, all others, and their world. I could go on, but I'll stop now. I'll stop now with one or two sentences on how to write trauma and healing. Because to write trauma and healing in our archive requires a different voice. Why? Because the archive, our archive, is an incomplete archive. I guess every archive is by definition incomplete. In any case, to write trauma and healing in our case, we have to embrace the fact of incompleteness, and yet at the same time open up the possibilities for this incompleteness speaking with a voice as full as possible. So for an incomplete, partial, and fragmented archive to speak with the fullness of a voice, a supplement is necessary. It has to be created, not out of nothing, but out of the debris of information, on the very site of the ruins, the remains, and traces left behind by those who passed away. So the voice has to shift. It has to shift because it must now confront something not so much unique as soiled. It must shift because it is dealing with wasted lives. The lives of people constrained to do things they might not have chosen to do themselves under conditions not of their own choice, once again, but they had to produce meaning, something that could eventually sustain some kind of life out of the brutalizing and life-negating conditions in which they found themselves. So the challenge, I'll end there, is how can we retrieve such lives from a broken existence and give them some kind of, provide them with some kind of home or place where they might be at peace, if you want. So that is what the style of writing we find in the best of the African and Afro-diasporic tradition. That is what it is trying to achieve. Thank you very much.
Could you get mics for, how much time? We have 10 minutes, right? 15 minutes? So before that question is answered, thank you very, very much for this very inspiring end-of-day lecture. It's more a conversation than a lecture, I think. There are hands already coming up, so we have 10 minutes. We have 10 minutes. Jeff.
Thank you for a wonderful talk and very provocative. You certainly, it seems to me, have captured extremely well the American experience, beginning with Tocqueville and Tocqueville's understanding and the pessimism that necessarily follows from that kind of thought. You mentioned Mandela as a kind of one lone figure who has, in a way, combated through what you call a kind of a violence towards himself, as a figure of a hopeful figure, although, as you say, he had 20 years in prison that was necessary to work on that. But I am wondering really about the South African case, and I'm wondering about something like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I'm wondering about the South African Constitution as really, despite all their limitations, really a new kind of discourse that's far more hopeful and possible because it really does engage the notion of care and repair, but at a social and political level. I just wonder what you would say to that.
I agree with you. I think that I mean, I'm not paid by the South African government to say what I'm going to say. But I do believe that something happened here that is, if not unique entirely, at least worthy of our attention, our intellectual, political, ethical consideration. Of course, we are living in a different epoch. This is no longer 1994. Claims for justice and transformation are mounting, just as they are mounting everywhere else. I've been following, I don't know how many of you are following what's going on in France with the yellow something really serious is going on there. Might not have a name yet, but something is unfolding there. The demand for some form of justice is once again right on top of the world agenda. And this has to do, obviously, with some of the transformations capitalism has been going through over the last, let's say, quarter of a century. So to some extent, what I started with, which may have left the impression that only blacks were subjected to this, might now be extended to more than black people. So there's a becoming black of our world, which is being propelled by these transformations of capitalism and the technological transformations of our age. And in that sense, it seems to me South Africa appears as a place from which we might think seriously, not only about the problems of South Africa, but the problems of our world, the politics, if you want, of the future world. Because just as when W.E.B. Du Bois was writing, we are facing once again the key question, the planetary question of the politics of the future world. And in that sense, a lot of the debates we have been having here since the beginning of the conference make perfect sense.
Thank you. Is this long? Is your hand? Yes, please. Go ahead and speak, please.
Lonwabo. Thank you, Prof. I'd like to thank you for your presentation. But my question is that, don't you think that we put a lot of focus and emphasis on reconciliation when there has not been what I would call a physical apology, or what would manifest itself as reparation, right? And its importance on the future world. Because the future world would then be a construct of what we do right now within our context and our narrative within the present. What we do with regards to reconciliation and reparation, and the future world would be the product of that. So again, do you not feel that we focus a lot on reconciliation with this, which might be a thing of the future, whereas the now focuses more on reparation and the physical apology? Thank you.
Maybe to just give.
Okay, we take 2 more questions. There's one, Homi. There's a mic just behind you.
Achille, I wondered whether your narrative would have been the same or how it would have been different had you started with Du Bois, who you just mentioned, which is why I feel so cued in. Because it seems to me that the situation you present is certainly of the indomitable contradiction and its racialization. And I'm now talking about the United States because, you know, that's where you based much of the conversation, starting with Tocqueville, is both worse at times, at certain historical moments, and better at times. So if you take the question of racialization, it's worse because it seems to me that deportation, and we see a lot of it now around the world, is one way of dealing with the problem. I think the way capital has dealt with the problem, even global capital today, is not only social death, but life death. You know, this idea of not of a living death or death in life, life and death. And there, the redundant populations are biopolitically integrated into the nation at various levels of subordination to produce that capital. So it's really, you know, I think deportation is in some ways a distraction. The real hell is in working the Hades, you know, as William Kentridge, one of my favorite lines from William Kentridge is that, you know, workers of the world, when they ascend to heaven or hell, they say, well, wherever we are, we will still need to drum the bells. You know, we will be brought in to make the thunder. So it seems to me that there is a worse situation almost of the entrapment, the carceral entrapment in the biopolitics. Now, you're absolutely right. Du Bois also believed that it was you know, it was both unsurmountable. I mean, the whole idea of double consciousness is about the unsurmountability and the struggle, as he says, between being the race man and being a kind of cosmopolitan. And you see that in Ta-Nehisi Coates too. So my suggestion would be that if you start with Du Bois, you get this other kind of population, the trapped population of racism. And that also is an internal difference because for a long time, and it is not true of African Americans, and I'll say that again and again, black lives do not matter in the way in which they should matter. But many other minorities, Jews, East Asians, my group, South Asians, have actually seen, despite the racism, America is a land of opportunity. That doesn't mean they're not racialized, you know. The Irish were racialized, the South Asians are racialized, they are. But I'm just saying that it's, you know, starting with Du Bois, where he says, you know, there is both beauty, there is both Jim Crow, and there is the beauty of Florida, and they coexist. I think that would speak, I think, to this notion of the use of the redundant population to produce the surplus. That's just my thought. Thank you very much for your talk.
No, it's a very, very interesting take, and I will definitely work with it. But you also raise, I mean, extremely interesting questions, and I would just like to comment on one or two of them as a kind of rejoinder. My feeling is that we have entered an entirely new age of capitalism, since, I mean, that's what it's a fact, it's not a fiction, capitalism. A new age of capitalism that is characterized, at least partly, by something I would call technological escalation. Technological escalation, which itself is presiding over the creation, if one wants, or the emergence of an entirely new figure of the human. A human that is increasingly and irreversibly tied to some form or another of a device or of an object. So that human cum thing or cum device is definitely, let's say, the emergence of this new figure of the human cum device is an event, the magnitude of which we have not yet appraised as we should. That on the one hand. On the other hand, I mean, judging just from some experiences here and in the rest of the continent, it seems to me that the biggest dilemma today is of course, it's still, I mean, exploitation, alienation is still a fact. But more and more, the biggest dilemma for many is to not be exploited at all. I don't know whether you see what I mean. I mean, I live in Johannesburg. Almost every single day, you have 1, 2, 3 people who knock at the door, because we are a very securitized city. They ring the bell. And then usually my wife Sarah asks me, okay, somebody's knocking at the door, go and I tell her, but I haven't invited anybody. He said, no, go and see what's going on. So I go, and most of the time these are people who tell you know what, do you have anything to do? It doesn't matter whatever kind of job, just give me a job. So it's not as if we have a labor reserved army that is waiting. It's that more and more people have become superfluous. And the drama for many is no longer to be exploited, it's to not be exploited. That there are many slaves in search of a master, but the masters have understood that owning slaves, I mean, it's totally cumbersome, you don't need them. And therefore, how does this translate in terms of the inscription in a bioeconomy, biopolitics, of entrapment, the kind of entrapment you were talking about, is really a serious matter. It's totally a serious matter.
Okay.
Yes. Yes. But we'll talk about it later.
Talk about it. It's a matter of time now. The answer to.
Oh, yes, but
No, no, he's answering.
you asked me whether we're not too busy talking about reconciliation. I mean, you see, Pumla is the person who has worked on that. and my answer is exactly like hers.
Which is what?
I can't run away. Look, I mean, the answer is that reconciliation doesn't mean much without justice. I mean, that's what it is. We can't be talking rhetorically about reconciliation if we don't practice justice. So the two go together. The condition for quote-unquote reconciliation to be meaningful at all is for it to translate into actual acts of justice, actual acts of sharing and repairing what it is that has been broken. That's my understanding of it. But I won't then stand up and say Mandela was a sellout. I mean, which is not what you said, but you know what I'm referring to. Okay, now can we stop?
Yeah, but can I put just one last thing? When you say it requires justice alongside it, what kind of justice? I mean, I know that this is a long kind of, but these are themes that are emerging here at this conference. What is the vision of that kind of justice? I know who's excited to hear you say that, probably Roger Friedman, who's doing our media communication at the back. I'm sure he's excited to hear just the word pairing reconciliation justice, but what does that, if you speak about repair and then justice at the same time, what does that look like? Is it possible that you are not, I mean, might we be thinking about justice not in terms of sending people to prison, but more in terms of social, economic justice? The kind of physical, that he mentioned the word physical apology, and I understood it to be meaning, what is the concrete gesture that, you know, that can be paired with this concept of justice, of reconciliation?
See, I think that's what the microphone.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, but Pumla, that's such a big topic. But let me just say this. Look, justice, as far as I understand it, in the South African context, and maybe some other context, in any case, in view of the history of this place, it begins, frankly, with the repair of all the infrastructures of life. Beginning with the environments that have been rendered toxic, materially, chemically, and otherwise. Because justice, we recognize it when two things happen. When, first of all, when these scarce resource, which the future is, when the future is open to all, not just a few. And second, when we have created the conditions that allow us to inhabit the world and to share it. Because the sharing it is the precondition for its durability, especially in this age of the Anthropocene. But all of that might sound terribly abstract. So let me give you some concrete examples of how we repair the world and environments that have been rendered toxic so as to open the future to all. One thing, for instance, is to give a home or a place of rest to those who perished. And we do this first through various mechanisms, finding out where they were dumped, giving them a proper burial, memorializing them in our public space, and so forth and so on. These are acts of justice and repair. It means also sharing the wealth of the nation, putting together economic policies that aim precisely at leaving nobody behind. It means rehabilitating those cultural expressions that were either destroyed or debased, affording dignity to all. It's a whole program, and I'm sure that was dealt with in some of the other sessions during this conference. But thank you very much. Yeah, thanks a lot.